Stolen Dignity. Thora Quinley arrived at Roosevelt High School on a grey September morning, with her shoulders slightly hunched and her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum tiles that stretched endlessly before her. The hallways smelled of industrial cleaner and the faint mustiness of old textbooks, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a persistent hum that seemed to vibrate inside her skull. She clutched the straps of her worn backpack, feeling the familiar weight of her carefully packed lunch nestled between her chemistry textbook and spiral notebooks. The brown paper bag contained a turkey sandwich her mother had made that morning, an apple, a small container of carrot sticks, and 2 homemade chocolate chip cookies wrapped in wax paper. Simple food that represented care and routine in an otherwise chaotic world. She was new to Roosevelt, having moved across the state just 3 weeks before school started, when her mother accepted a nursing position at County Medical Center. Everything about this place felt foreign and overwhelming. The building itself was massive, a sprawling complex of brick and concrete that housed over 2,000 students who seemed to move through the corridors with practiced confidence, knowing exactly where they belonged and who they were supposed to be. Thora felt like a ghost, drifting through their world, invisible and insubstantial, trying desperately not to draw attention to herself. At 5'3" and barely 100 pounds, she knew she looked like an easy target. Her frame was slight, her features delicate, with light brown hair that hung straight to her shoulders and grey eyes that tended to avoid direct contact. She dressed in unremarkable clothes, jeans and plain t-shirts, a zip-up hoodie when the morning chill demanded it, nothing that would make her stand out in any way. She had learned early in life that being noticed often meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability invited cruelty from those who fed on weakness like predators circling wounded prey. What no one at Roosevelt High School knew, what no one could possibly suspect from looking at her thin arms and quiet demeanor, was that Thora woke every morning at 5 o'clock and spent 90 minutes at Alvarez Boxing Gym 3 blocks from her apartment. She had been training since she was 9 years old, taught first by her father and then, after his death 4 years ago, by Coach Maria Alvarez, who had promised to continue the work he had started. Thora's hands, though small, were calloused and strong. Her reflexes were honed sharp through thousands of hours of sparring and drilling. She understood timing and distance and leverage in ways that would shock anyone who saw her flinch when someone raised their voice too loudly in her direction. But she had made a promise to her father on his deathbed, his hand gripping hers with desperate strength as monitors beeped their steady rhythm in the hospital room. He had been a Golden Gloves champion in his youth, a talented boxer who had turned down professional opportunities to focus on family and a steady career as an electrician. But the violence of the sport had followed him in other ways, manifesting in a temper he struggled to control, in altercations outside the ring that brought shame and regret. In his final days, after the heart attack that would claim him at 41, he had made Thora swear she would never use her skills in anger, never let the discipline he taught her become a weapon of revenge or pride. "Fighting is about control," he had whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "Control of your body, control of your emotions, control of when to throw a punch and when to walk away. Promise me you'll remember that. Promise me you won't become what I was, someone who couldn't tell the difference between the ring and real life." She had promised, and she had kept that promise even when everything inside her screamed to break it. The first incident happened on her 3rd day at Roosevelt. She was walking down the main hallway toward her locker, navigating the crowd of students who clustered in groups and flowed in streams toward their various destinations. She didn't see the foot that extended into her path, didn't register the danger until her toe caught and she stumbled forward, arms windmilling as her backpack swung wildly. She managed to catch herself against a locker with a metallic crash that echoed through the corridor, and laughter erupted from somewhere behind her. "Watch where you're going, new girl," a voice called out, dripping with amusement and disdain. Thora steadied herself and turned to see 3 students watching her with expressions that ranged from mild interest to open mockery. The one in the center, the one whose foot had clearly been the obstacle, stood with her arms crossed and her chin lifted in a posture of casual dominance. Her name was Vanessa Sterling, though Thora wouldn't learn that until later. She was tall and athletic, with long dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail and features that were objectively attractive in that specific way that seemed to grant certain people immunity from consequences. She wore designer jeans and a fitted jacket that probably cost more than Thora's entire wardrobe, and she carried herself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never experienced genuine adversity. "Sorry," Thora mumbled, turning back to her locker without meeting anyone's eyes. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the familiar burn of humiliation that made her want to disappear into the floor. "She said sorry," one of Vanessa's companions said, her voice sugary with false sympathy. "That's so polite." This was Kendall Morris, a girl with auburn curls and a smile that never quite reached her cold blue eyes. She would become one of Vanessa's most loyal followers in the weeks ahead. The third member of the group, a stocky girl named Brianna Cross, with bleached blonde hair and multiple ear piercings, laughed loudly. "Yeah, real polite. Maybe too polite. What's wrong with you, new girl? Cat got your tongue?" Thora opened her locker, hands trembling slightly as she exchanged books for her first period English class. She kept her head down, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. Every instinct she had developed over years of training told her to pivot, to create distance, to assess the threat level, and prepare for engagement. But she pushed those instincts down, buried them beneath the weight of her promise and the knowledge that fighting back would only make everything worse. The 3 girls eventually moved on, their laughter fading into the general noise of the hallway. Thora closed her locker and headed to class, her heart rate gradually returning to normal. It was nothing, she told herself, just a small incident easily forgotten. She could endure this. She had endured worse. But the incidents didn't stop. They multiplied and evolved, like a virus adapting to its host. The following day, someone accidentally bumped into her hard enough to send her books scattering across the cafeteria floor. She knelt to gather them while students stepped over and around her, some offering apologetic glances, but none stopping to help. She saw Vanessa watching from a table near the windows, saw the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, and understood with sinking certainty that this was intentional. This was targeted. She had somehow been marked as prey. By the end of her first full week at Roosevelt, Thora had learned to recognize the warning signs. She could sense when Vanessa and her group were nearby, could feel their attention like a physical pressure against her skin. She adjusted her routes through the building, tried to time her movements to avoid crossing paths with them, ate lunch quickly and left the cafeteria before they finished their meals. She became a student of patterns and probabilities, calculating risk with each decision about where to walk and when to move. But Roosevelt was only so large, and there were only so many ways to navigate from classroom to classroom without being seen. The shoulder bumps became routine. Walking down the hallway, she would suddenly feel the jarring impact as Vanessa or one of her friends accidentally collided with her, sending Thora stumbling sideways while they continued on without acknowledgement. Her books were knocked from her arms with increasing frequency, papers scattering and forcing her to scramble to collect them, while the traffic of students flowed around her like water around a rock. Once, someone emptied the contents of her backpack when she left it unattended for 3 minutes to use the bathroom, and she returned to find her belongings strewn across the floor outside the girls' restroom, while Vanessa and Kendall stood nearby, examining their phones with studied disinterest. "You should be more careful with your stuff," Vanessa said, without looking up from her screen. "Someone might steal it." Thora gathered her things in silence, Her jaw clenched tight enough to make her teeth ache. She could feel the familiar sensation of her hands forming fists, knuckles pressing against the calluses that marked years of impact against heavy bags and focus mitts. She breathed through her nose, deep and controlled, the way Coach Maria had taught her to manage adrenaline during sparring sessions. Center yourself. Find your balance. Control your response. She kept walking, kept her head down, kept her promise. The other students at Roosevelt began to notice the pattern. Thora saw it in their glances, in the way conversations would pause when she entered a room, in the careful distance people maintained, as if whatever was happening to her might be contagious. A few looked sympathetic, but sympathy without action was just another form of abandonment. No one spoke up, no one intervened. The teachers, when they witnessed the incidents at all, seemed to look right through them, treating obvious harassment as mere accidents or misunderstandings not worthy of their attention. In her third week, Thora sat alone at a corner table in the cafeteria, methodically working through her packed lunch, while trying to become as small and unnoticeable as possible. The cafeteria was a massive space with rows of long tables, high ceilings that amplified every sound into a constant roar of voices and clattering trays, and windows along one wall that let in harsh afternoon sunlight. The smell of institutional food, pizza and French fries and whatever mysterious casserole the kitchen staff had prepared, hung heavy in the air, mixed with disinfectant, and the general musk of hundreds of bodies in close proximity. She had just bitten into her sandwich when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to see Vanessa standing there with Kendall and Brianna flanking her like bodyguards. Several other students hovered nearby, not quite part of the group but orbiting close enough to signal their allegiance, or at least their interest, in the entertainment about to unfold. "That looks good," Vanessa said, nodding toward Thora's lunch. "I forgot mine today. Mind if I have it?" Thora's heart kicked into a higher gear. She could feel the attention of nearby tables turning toward their interaction, could sense the anticipation building like static electricity before a storm. "I do mind, actually," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise. "I need it." "What was that?" Vanessa leaned forward, hand cupped behind her ear in exaggerated fashion. "I couldn't hear you. Did you just tell me no?" "I need my lunch," Thora repeated, slightly louder this time. Her hands remained in her lap, out of sight beneath the table edge. She was gripping her thighs to keep her fingers from trembling, or worse, from forming the fighting stance that muscle memory wanted to create. "That's so selfish," Kendall chimed in, shaking her head with mock disappointment. "Vanessa just asked nicely. You could at least share." Before Thora could respond, before she could even process what was happening, Vanessa's hand shot out and grabbed the brown paper bag containing the rest of her lunch. Thora instinctively reached for it, but Brianna stepped forward and put a hand on her shoulder, pressing down with enough force to keep her seated. The message was clear and physical. Don't resist. Vanessa opened the bag and peered inside with theatrical interest. "Oh, cookies! Homemade. Your mum must really love you." She pulled out one of the chocolate chip cookies and took a large bite, chewing slowly while maintaining eye contact with Thora. Then she handed the bag to Kendall, who pulled out the apple and took a loud, crunching bite. "Delicious," Kendall said. "You should tell your mom she's a great cook." Thora sat frozen, feeling the weight of Brianna's hand still on her shoulder, feeling the eyes of everyone around them watching this public humiliation unfold. Her face burned with shame and rage, emotions warring inside her chest like trapped animals desperate for release. The turkey sandwich sat heavy in her stomach, suddenly difficult to digest. She wanted to stand, wanted to knock Brianna's hand away and reclaim what was hers, wanted to show them exactly what she was capable of doing with her small fists and her years of training. Instead, She did nothing. She sat there while they finished her cookies and tossed the empty bag back onto her table while they walked away, laughing and high-fiving each other for their successful raid. She sat there while the cafeteria gradually returned to its normal volume, the moment of entertainment passing and being forgotten, even as it carved itself into Thora's memory with surgical precision. When the lunch period ended, she threw away what little remained and went to her next class with an empty stomach and a full heart, full of anger, full of shame, full of questions about how much more she could endure before something inside her snapped. That weekend, alone in her bedroom with the door closed against the world, Thora lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling while replaying every humiliation in her mind. Her phone sat beside her, silent and accusatory. She had no friends to text, no one to talk to about what was happening. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital and came home exhausted, collapsing into sleep without enough energy left over to notice the changes in her daughter's demeanor. Thora didn't want to burden her anyway. They had moved here for her mother's career, for a fresh start after her father's death had left them struggling financially and emotionally. Complaining about school problems seemed selfish when her mother was sacrificing so much, so Thora kept it inside, let it accumulate like pressure in a sealed container, and told herself she could handle it. She had handled worse. Her father's death had been worse. The year after, when her mother had barely been able to function, when Thora had taken over cooking and cleaning and managing their household at age 10, that had been worse. This was just high school. These were just stupid kids playing stupid games. She could endure it. On Monday morning, she woke at 5 as always and went to Alvarez Boxing Gym for her training session. The gym was located in a converted warehouse with concrete floors, exposed pipes running along the ceiling, and the permanent smell of sweat and leather that Thora found oddly comforting. Heavy bags hung from thick chains at various stations. A ring dominated the center of the space with ropes slightly frayed from years of use, and speed bags mounted on platforms created a rhythmic percussion whenever someone worked them. Coach Maria was already there, as she always was, a compact woman in her 50s with grey-streaked black hair pulled into a tight bun and hands that bore the scars of a lifetime in the sport. She had been a professional boxer herself, had fought for a regional championship before an injury ended her career, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Good morning, Thora," she said, looking up from the clipboard where she tracked her students' progress. "You ready to work?" "Yes, coach," Thora replied, setting her gym bag down on the bench and beginning to wrap her hands with practiced efficiency. The ritual of wrapping was meditative, each loop and turn creating layers of protection and support that transformed her hands from vulnerable flesh into weapons of precise impact. She had done this thousands of times, and the muscle memory was soothing in its familiarity. They started with jump rope, 3 rounds of 3 minutes each, with 1 minute rest between rounds. Thora's feet moved in quick, light patterns against the concrete floor, the rope whistling through the air in rhythm with her breathing. Then shadow boxing, where she moved around the gym, throwing combinations at invisible opponents, working on her footwork and head movement, pivoting and slipping and creating angles the way Coach Maria had drilled into her until it became instinct. "Good," Coach Maria called out. "Stay light on your feet. Remember, power comes from your legs and hips, not from swinging wild. Control. Always control." Thora moved through her combinations, jab, cross, hook, uppercut, each punch snapping out and returning to her guard position with practiced precision. Her body knew these movements better than anything else in her life. Here, in the gym, she wasn't a victim. She wasn't weak or helpless. She was a fighter, skilled and capable, someone who could handle herself in any physical confrontation. But that wasn't the same as being able to use those skills outside the gym, and the frustration of that reality weighed on her, even as she moved through her training. After shadow boxing came heavy bag work, and this was where Thora could release some of the emotion building inside her. She stood in front of a worn leather-heavy bag that bore the marks of countless impacts, set her stance with her left foot forward and her weight balanced, and began to work. Jab to establish range, cross to drive through the target, hook to the body to attack the ribs, uppercut to come up through the middle. The bag swung and jumped with each impact, the chains creaking overhead, and Thora felt the satisfying shock of connection travel up her arms, into her shoulders and core. 3-minute round, Coach Maria said, starting the timer. Keep your combinations clean. Don't arm punch. Turn your hips. Use your whole body. Thora worked the bag with increasing intensity, sweat beginning to bead on her forehead and soak through her grey tank top. Her breathing settled into rhythm with her punches, sharp exhales with each impact. She moved around the bag, cutting angles, slipping imaginary counters, maintaining her guard, even when attacking. The rest of the world fell away, reduced to the simple clarity of the training session. The immediate feedback of her fists against the bag, the burning in her shoulders and arms that told her she was pushing herself hard enough to improve. After heavy bag work came focus mitt drills with Coach Maria. The coach stood in the center of the ring with thick leather mitts on her hands, moving and calling combinations while Thora pursued her and landed clean shots against the targets. Jab, jab, cross, Coach Maria called, and Thora responded instantly, her punches cracking into the mitts with satisfying precision. Hook, uppercut, cross. Thora's body obeyed without conscious thought, the combinations ingrained so deeply they bypassed her conscious mind entirely. Good. Now slip left, counter right hand, left hook to the body, pivot out. The drill continued for 3 hard rounds, Coach Maria constantly adjusting her position and calling new combinations, forcing Thora to react and adapt in real time. This was where boxing became more than just punching. It became chess at high speed, a constant problem-solving exercise where position and timing meant everything. When the timer finally buzzed to signal the end of the session, Thora stood in the ring with her hands on her knees, chest heaving and sweat dripping onto the canvas floor. Every muscle in her body ached with the good kind of pain that came from hard work, and her mind felt clearer than it had in days. Coach Maria approached and offered her a water bottle, watching her with the careful attention of someone who saw more than most people did. "You've been working hard," she said, "but I sense something else going on. You're fighting like you're angry at the mitts. Want to talk about it?" Thora straightened and took a long drink of water, considering how much to share. Coach Maria was one of the few people who knew about the promise she had made to her father, who understood the internal struggle of having skills you couldn't use. "Just school stuff," she said finally. "Nothing I can't handle." "School stuff," Coach Maria repeated, her tone making it clear she understood this was an understatement. "Are you being safe?" "I'm not fighting," Thora said quickly. "I'm keeping my promise. It's frustrating sometimes, being able to do something but choosing not to." Coach Maria nodded slowly, her dark eyes searching Thora's face. "That's the hardest part of martial arts that nobody talks about. It's easy to fight when you're scared or angry. Any idiot can throw a punch. The discipline is in knowing when not to, in walking away even when you could win." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But there's a difference between walking away from a fair fight and letting yourself be victimized. You understand that, right? Your father didn't want you to become a bully or start fights out of ego. That's different from defending yourself when you have no other choice." "I know," Thora said quietly. "But how do I know when I've crossed that line? When does enduring become enabling? When does patience become cowardice?" "You'll know," Coach Maria said with conviction. "When that moment comes, your instincts will tell you. Until then, stay smart, stay aware, and if you need to talk, I'm here." Thora thanked her and left the gym as the early morning sun began to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She walked the 3 blocks home, her gym bag slung over her shoulder and her body still warm from exertion, and tried to hold on to the clarity and confidence she felt after training. But by the time she reached her apartment building and started preparing for another day at Roosevelt, the familiar anxiety had crept back in, settling over her like a heavy coat. The 4th week at Roosevelt brought an escalation Thora hadn't anticipated. She arrived at her locker on Tuesday morning to find it had been vandalized overnight. Someone had scratched the word freak into the metal in jagged letters, and when she opened it, she discovered that someone had emptied a can of soda inside, ruining several of her textbooks and soaking through her spare gym clothes. The sticky liquid had dried into a tacky mess that required her to wipe down everything with paper towels from the bathroom while other students walked past and pretended not to notice. She reported it to the vice principal, Mr. Henderson, a tired-looking man in his 50s, who listened to her complaint with an expression of vague sympathy that didn't translate into any meaningful action. "I'll look into it," he said, making a note on a pad of paper that would probably be forgotten by the end of the day. "But without any witnesses or evidence of who did it, there's not much we can do." "Could have been anyone. You're new here. Maybe you haven't made the best first impression with some students. Consider being more social, joining some activities. That might help you fit in better." Thora left his office feeling more alone than ever, understanding with perfect clarity that she would receive no help from the administration. She was on her own in this. The vandalism continued throughout the week. Her locker was broken into twice more, the contents rearranged or stolen. Someone scratched her car in the parking lot with a key, leaving a long gouge in the paint that would cost money she didn't have to repair. She found notes stuck to her locker with tape, messages that ranged from crude insults to more creative cruelty. "Nobody likes you. Go back where you came from. You're worthless." Each note was like a small knife wound, individually minor but collectively devastating. And through it all, Vanessa and her group maintained a facade of innocence, never caught in the act, always positioned at a safe distance with perfect alibis. They would smile at her in the hallways with false sweetness, ask loudly if she was okay when they passed her scrubbing out her locker, offer sympathetic expressions that barely concealed their satisfaction at her suffering. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. They had somehow recruited other students to participate, or at least to maintain silence, creating a culture where harassing Thora was acceptable or even entertaining. She began to recognize the pattern. When she entered the cafeteria, conversations would pause and resume in whispers, punctuated by glances in her direction. When she sat down, students nearby would find reasons to relocate to other tables, leaving her in a bubble of empty seats that broadcast her social isolation to everyone watching. Her lunch continued to be a target. On Wednesday, Vanessa simply walked up to her table, grabbed her entire brown paper bag, and walked away with it while Thora sat frozen by the same mixture of shock and helplessness that had paralyzed her the first time. On Thursday, Kendall dumped a carton of chocolate milk over Thora's sandwich, rendering it inedible while claiming it was an accident and offering an apology so insincere it was worse than saying nothing. On Friday, Brianna sat down uninvited at Thora's table and slowly, deliberately ate her own lunch while staring at Thora's food with such obvious intent that Thora ended up leaving without eating rather than enduring whatever humiliation was being planned. By the end of the 4th week, Thora had lost 7 pounds. Her mother noticed and expressed concern, but Thora deflected with excuses about being stressed with schoolwork and not having time to eat properly. She couldn't bring herself to explain the truth, that the simple act of eating lunch at school had become a daily ordeal she dreaded more than anything else in her life. In her 5th week at Roosevelt, everything shifted when Ren Castellanos spoke to her. It happened in the library during Thora's free period. a time she had learned to cherish because the library was a neutral zone where Vanessa and her group rarely appeared. The space was quiet and ordered, with rows of books standing like silent sentinels and long tables where students could spread out and work without the social pressures of the cafeteria or common areas. Thora sat in a corner with her chemistry textbook open, trying to focus on balancing equations while her stomach growled its protest at having been denied adequate food for days. "Hey, is anyone sitting here?" Thora looked up to see a student she vaguely recognized from her English class standing by the empty chair across from her. Ren Castellanos was striking in a way that transcended conventional beauty, tall and lean with light brown skin, dark hair cut in a short, asymmetric style that fell across one side of her face, and eyes that were an unusual shade of amber gold. She wore black jeans with strategic rips at the knees, combat boots that looked both fashionable and functional, and a band t-shirt under an open flannel shirt. She carried herself with a kind of confident self-possession that suggested she wasn't overly concerned with other people's opinions. "No," Thora said quietly, surprised by the question. "It's empty." "Cool." Ren dropped into the chair and pulled out her own textbook along with a notebook covered in stickers from various bands and causes. She began working without further comment, and for several minutes they existed in companionable silence, just two students studying in proximity without the weight of social obligation. Then Ren looked up and said, casually but with clear intent, "I saw what Vanessa did to your lunch yesterday. That was bullshit." Thora's hand froze in the act of turning a page. She didn't know how to respond, didn't trust this sudden attention even if it seemed sympathetic. "It's fine," she said automatically, the reflex of someone who had learned to minimize everything to avoid conflict. "It's not fine," Ren said matter-of-factly. "It's bullying, and it's not okay. I wanted you to know that not everyone here thinks that's acceptable behavior. Some of us actually have functioning moral compasses." Thora risked making eye contact and found Ren looking at her with an expression of genuine concern mixed with frustration. "Why didn't you say something?" Thora asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why doesn't anyone say anything?" Ren's jaw tightened. "Because people are cowards. Because Vanessa's dad is on the school board and everyone knows she gets special treatment. Because standing up for someone else means potentially becoming the next target, and most people aren't brave enough to take that risk." She paused, then added with a wry smile, "But I've always been better at doing the right thing than the smart thing." Something in Thora's chest loosened slightly, some small knot of tension that had been wound tight for weeks. "I'm Thora," she said, feeling the need to introduce herself properly, even though Ren clearly already knew who she was. "Ren. And before you ask, yes, like the bird. My mum's a wildlife biologist with a sense of humor." She returned her attention to her textbook for a moment, then added without looking up, "You should eat lunch with me tomorrow. I usually sit outside by the art building. It's quieter. And Vanessa's crowd doesn't go there because they consider art kids beneath them." Thora felt a surge of hope so intense it was almost painful, followed immediately by fear that this was somehow a trick or a setup for more elaborate humiliation. "Why are you being nice to me?" she asked, hating how vulnerable the question made her sound. Ren looked up again, her expression serious. "Because nobody should have to go through what you're going through alone. Because I know what it's like to be different and targeted for it, and because you seem like someone worth knowing, and I've learned to trust my instincts about people." She shrugged. "Also, my mum raised me to stand up to bullies, and I figure if I don't practice what I preach, I'm just another hypocrite." For the first time in weeks, Thora felt herself smile genuinely. It was small and tentative, like a plant pushing through concrete, but it was real. "Okay," she said, "I'd like that." They spent the rest of the period working in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging comments about their assignments or commiserating about difficult teachers. When the bell rang and they packed up their belongings, Wren walked with Thora toward her next class, maintaining a running commentary about the various social hierarchies and unwritten rules of Roosevelt High School. "The jocks are okay if you ignore their inflated egos," Wren explained as they navigated the crowded hallway. "The theater kids are dramatic, but harmless. The band geeks are actually pretty cool once you get past their terrible jokes. The student government types take themselves way too seriously, but they're not actively malicious. And then there's Vanessa's group, the apex predators who mistake cruelty for sophistication and think their parents' money makes them important." "Why is she like that?" Thora asked, genuinely curious about what drove someone to dedicate so much energy to making another person miserable. Wren snorted. "Classic case of someone who has everything handed to them, but still feels empty inside, so they try to fill the void by exerting power over others. Her dad's some big-shot corporate lawyer who's never home. Her mom's more concerned with maintaining her social status than actually parenting, and Vanessa learned early that being feared is easier than being liked. Plus, I think she genuinely believes she's better than everyone else, not just in status but as a human being. It's gross, but it's also kind of pathetic when you think about it." They reached Thora's classroom, and Wren paused before heading to her own class. "Tomorrow at lunch, yeah? North side of the art building. There's a courtyard with tables that nobody uses." "I'll be there," Thora promised, and she meant it. That night, for the first time since starting at Roosevelt, Thora went to sleep feeling something other than dread about the next day. The following afternoon, Thora found Wren sitting at a weathered picnic table in the courtyard she had described, a space sheltered by tall oak trees that provided shade and a sense of privacy from the main campus. The art building itself was older than the main school structure, built in a different era with actual architectural character, arched windows and brick walls covered in ivy. The courtyard felt separate from the rest of Roosevelt, a small pocket of peace where the usual social dynamics seemed not to apply. Wren was working on something in a sketchbook when Thora approached, her hand moving in quick, confident strokes across the page. She looked up and smiled. "You came." "Good. I wasn't entirely sure you would." "Why wouldn't I?" Thora asked, settling onto the bench across from her. "Because sometimes victims of bullying start to believe they deserve it, or that friendship is somehow dangerous. Stockholm Syndrome meets isolation trauma." Wren closed her sketchbook and gestured to the space around them. "Welcome to my sanctuary. Not much, but it's better than the cafeteria combat zone." They ate together. Wren had packed an elaborate lunch from home that included what looked like homemade sushi rolls and a thermos of miso soup, while Thora had her standard turkey sandwich and fruit. For the first time in weeks, she ate her entire lunch without interruption, and the simple act of consuming food in peace felt like a profound luxury. They talked about music and discovered a shared love of indie rock bands that most of their peers had never heard of. They discussed books, finding common ground in their appreciation for science fiction and fantasy. Wren showed her some of her sketches, intricate drawings of imaginary creatures and architectural designs that demonstrated real talent. Thora found herself opening up about her mother's work at the hospital, about how they had moved from across the state for a fresh start, though she carefully avoided mentioning her father or the boxing training that occupied her mornings. "What do you do for fun?" Wren asked at one point. "Like hobbies or whatever?" Thora hesitated, then offered a partial truth. "I work out a lot. Running mostly. It helps clear my head." The lie felt necessary, an instinct to protect the secret she had kept for so long. "I get that," Wren said. "I do yoga sometimes. It's good for managing anxiety, which I have in abundance thanks to my brain's faulty wiring." She said it casually, without self-pity, just stating a fact. I'm on medication for it, which helps, but I still have to actively work at staying balanced. Thora appreciated the honesty, the vulnerability that Wren offered without prompting. It made her own carefully maintained walls feel less necessary, though she still wasn't ready to lower them completely. They talked until the warning bell rang, signaling that lunch was ending and they needed to head to their next classes. As they gathered their belongings, Wren said, "Same time tomorrow." "Definitely," Thora agreed, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of genuine connection. But as they walked back toward the main building, Thora spotted Vanessa and her group near the entrance, and she saw the exact moment when they noticed Thora wasn't alone. Vanessa's expression shifted from bored disinterest to sharp attention, her eyes narrowing as she tracked Thora and Wren's approach. "Well, well," Vanessa said loudly as they passed, "looks like the lonely loser found another reject to commiserate with. How touching." Wren didn't break stride or acknowledge the comment, but Thora saw her jaw tighten and her shoulders square slightly. They continued past without responding, but Thora's brief moment of happiness curdled into worry. She had found a friend, but in doing so, she had potentially painted a target on someone else. Her fears proved correct over the following days. The bullying that had previously focused exclusively on Thora began to expand its scope to include Wren by association. Kendall accidentally spilled juice on Wren's backpack in the hallway. Someone scratched the word "freak" on Wren's locker, mirroring the treatment Thora had received. Notes began appearing in Wren's belongings, messages that suggested she should reconsider her friendship choices if she wanted to maintain any social standing at Roosevelt. Wren handled it with a combination of stoicism and dark humor that Thora found both admirable and concerning. "They're just proving my point," she said when Thora apologized for bringing trouble into her life. "They're bullies who can't stand anyone defying their social hierarchy. This isn't your fault, it's theirs. Don't let them make you feel guilty for having a friend." But guilt gnawed at Thora anyway, joining the growing collection of emotions she was struggling to contain. She had made a promise to her father not to fight, to walk away from conflict, to be better than the violence that had marked his life. But watching Wren suffer consequences for showing her kindness tested that promise in ways she hadn't anticipated. The patience she had been clinging to began to feel less like virtue and more like cowardice. During their lunch sessions in the courtyard, which continued despite the escalating harassment, Thora found herself observing Wren more carefully. She noticed the way Wren's hands moved when she sketched, the precision and confidence in every line. She noticed how Wren's face lit up when she talked about architecture, her dream of designing buildings that would reshape urban spaces. She noticed the small scar on Wren's left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident, and the way she pushed her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating on something difficult. And she noticed, with a mixture of surprise and inevitability, that what she felt when looking at Wren went beyond simple friendship and gratitude. There was an attraction there, undeniable and growing, though Thora had no idea if Wren felt the same way or would even be interested in girls. The realization added another layer of complexity to her already complicated emotional state, another thing she needed to process and protect and keep hidden. In their 6th week of friendship, during a particularly comfortable lunch, where they had been sharing earbuds and listening to music together, Wren suddenly said, "I need to tell you something." Thora's heart rate spiked with anxiety. "Okay." "I'm gay," Wren said, her tone matter-of-fact, but her eyes watching Thora's reaction carefully. "I figured I should mention it because we're becoming real friends, and I don't like hiding important things from people I care about. If that's weird for you or makes you uncomfortable, I understand, but I needed to be honest." Relief and hope flooded through Thora in equal measure. "It's not weird," she said quickly. "At all. I think I might be too. Or maybe bi. I'm still figuring it out. She had never said that out loud before, had barely admitted it to herself, but the words came easier than she expected. Wren's expression softened into a genuine smile, one that transformed her entire face with warmth. Yeah? That's cool. Well, if you ever want to talk about it or process stuff, I'm here. Figuring out your sexuality is complicated enough without also dealing with asshole bullies at the same time. They talked more after that, sharing experiences and feelings they had each kept private for years. Wren described realizing she was gay in middle school, the fear of coming out to her parents that had turned out to be unnecessary because they were completely supportive, the relief of living authentically even when it meant facing discrimination from some peers. Thora talked about her confusion, her awareness that she noticed girls in ways that seemed different from simple friendship, her fear of adding another way to be different in a world that already felt hostile. The conversation brought them closer, creating a bond of shared vulnerability that felt precious and fragile. When they finally had to leave for class, Wren reached across the table and squeezed Thora's hand briefly. The touch was electric, sending warmth up Thora's arm and straight to her chest, and she knew with certainty that what she felt was more than friendship, even if acting on it seemed impossible given their current circumstances. But Vanessa must have noticed the growing closeness between them, must have sensed that their relationship had shifted into territory that threatened her campaign of isolation. The harassment escalated dramatically in the 7th week, becoming more focused and more vicious. It started on a Monday morning, when Thora arrived at school to find her locker covered in printed photographs. Someone had used photo editing software to create obscene images, superimposing Thora's face onto various compromising positions, then plastered them across her locker door and the surrounding wall. Students gathered to stare and whisper, some looking uncomfortable, others laughing and taking pictures with their phones. Thora stood frozen, feeling like she might vomit from the combination of rage and humiliation. Before she could figure out how to respond, Wren appeared beside her and immediately began tearing down the photos, ripping them into pieces with furious efficiency. "Get out of here," she shouted at the gawking students. "What's wrong with you? This is sexual harassment. Go the fuck away." Most of the crowd dispersed, though phones continued recording from safer distances. Thora helped Wren remove the photos, her hands shaking with suppressed emotion. When they were done, Wren turned to her and said fiercely, "We're reporting this. This crossed a line. We're going to Mr. Henderson right now." But Henderson's response was predictably useless. He looked at the photos they had saved as evidence, sighed deeply, and said, "This is inappropriate, certainly. But I can't do anything without proof of who created or posted them. And honestly, you two might want to consider whether your behavior is inviting this kind of attention." "Our behavior?" Wren's voice rose dangerously. "What behavior? Existing, being friends, eating lunch together? Please explain what we're doing that justifies sexual harassment." "I'm not justifying anything," Henderson said, his tone suggesting he was already tired of this conversation. "I'm simply suggesting that if you're going to be openly affectionate in ways that some students might find unusual, you should expect some reaction. Not everyone is comfortable with that lifestyle. We're not even—" Wren started, then stopped and laughed bitterly. "You know what? Fuck this. We're not the problem here, and your refusal to do anything about actual harassment makes you complicit. Come on, Thora. We're leaving." They walked out of Henderson's office and made their way to the courtyard in silence. When they finally sat down at their usual table, Wren looked at Thora and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you're dealing with this, and I'm sorry that who I am is making it worse for you." "Don't," Thora said firmly, finding her voice despite everything. "Don't apologize for being yourself. This isn't your fault. It's Vanessa and her group, And it's cowards like Henderson who refuse to intervene. You're the only good thing about this place." Wren's eyes glistened slightly. "You know what the worst part is? They're getting away with it. They're going to keep doing this because nobody will stop them, because they have power and privilege, and they know how to use it." Thora felt something shifting inside her, some fundamental piece of her resolve cracking under the accumulated weight of weeks of abuse. She thought about her father's promise, about the reasons she had stayed passive and endured everything thrown at her. But she also thought about the difference between being a bully and defending yourself, about the line Coach Maria had described between avoiding violence out of ego and protecting yourself and others when pushed too far. How much more was she expected to endure? How much more should Wren have to suffer? At what point did endurance become enabling, and when did choosing peace over action become choosing to let cruelty flourish unchecked? The following Wednesday, the lunch theft that had been an ongoing pattern escalated into something far more calculated and cruel. Thora and Wren were eating together as usual in their courtyard sanctuary when Vanessa's entire group appeared, including several faces Thora hadn't seen involved in the harassment before. They surrounded the picnic table in a loose semicircle, blocking easy escape routes, their body language radiating hostile intent. "Having a little date?" Vanessa asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "That's adorable. The two rejects finding love in a hopeless place." "Walk away, Vanessa," Wren said, her voice steady, but Thora could see the tension in her shoulders. "We're not doing this with you." "Oh, but I think we are," Vanessa replied. She reached down and grabbed Wren's lunch bag from the table, holding it up like a trophy. "I'm still hungry." "You don't mind sharing, right?" Wren stood quickly. "Give it back. Now." Vanessa laughed and tossed the bag to Kendall, who tossed it to Brianna, creating a game of keep-away while Wren tried to intercept. Thora watched, her hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough to make her knuckles white. She could feel her heart rate increasing, feel the familiar pre-fight adrenaline beginning to course through her system, the same sensation she experienced before sparring, the body's preparation for combat. Then Vanessa's attention shifted to Thora's lunch, and she reached for it with a smirk. "Let's see what Mommy packed today." Thora's hand moved before her conscious mind registered the decision. She didn't grab Vanessa's wrist. That would have been aggressive, initiating contact. Instead, she simply caught Vanessa's hand in mid-reach, stopping the movement with surprising strength, given Thora's small frame. The grip was firm but not painful, more statement than threat, but it was enough to shock everyone present into stillness. Vanessa's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in anger. "Let go of me." "Leave my lunch alone," Thora said, her voice quiet but carrying an undertone that hadn't been there before, something harder, something warned of consequences. "And give Wren her lunch back." For a moment, genuine uncertainty flickered across Vanessa's face. She wasn't accustomed to resistance, especially not physical resistance, from someone she had categorized as completely helpless. But then her ego reasserted itself, the need to maintain dominance overriding any sense of caution. She tried to yank her hand free, but Thora's grip remained steady. The quality of that grip, the way it controlled without crushing, spoke to training and discipline that shouldn't have been present in a small, quiet girl who had been nothing but passive for weeks. "I said, let go," Vanessa repeated, her voice rising, aware that her followers were watching and expecting her to reassert control. Thora released her hand but didn't break eye contact. Something had shifted in her demeanor, in the way she held herself. Her posture was straighter, her gaze direct and unflinching, and the usual hunched, defensive body language was absent. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt, she looked like someone who could handle herself, and the change was striking enough to create a pocket of uncomfortable silence. "We're done here," Thora said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Give Wren her lunch back and walk away." Kendall, still holding Wren's lunch bag, glanced at Vanessa uncertainly. The social script they had been following, bully the weak, face no consequences, maintain dominance, had suddenly been disrupted, and none of them seemed certain how to proceed. Vanessa's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She couldn't back down in front of her group, couldn't afford to show weakness in the same social hierarchy she had weaponized. "You don't give me orders," she said, her voice shaking slightly with rage. "You're nobody. You're nothing." She shoved Thora's shoulder, a gesture meant to provoke a reaction she could then use as justification for escalation. Thora absorbed the shove without moving backward, her center of gravity too stable to be easily displaced. Proper stance, proper balance, the result of thousands of hours training footwork and base. The fact that she didn't stumble or flinch only made Vanessa angrier. "Fight me then," Vanessa said, raising her voice loud enough that students from other parts of the courtyard began to notice and drift closer. "If you think you're so tough, fight me right now. Let's see what you've got." "I don't want to fight you," Thora said, and it was true despite everything inside her that was screaming for release. "I just want you to leave us alone." "Because you're scared," Vanessa taunted, playing to the growing crowd. "Because you know I'd destroy you. You're a coward hiding behind your weird girlfriend." Wren stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "She's not the coward here, Vanessa. You are. You only attack people you think can't fight back, and you only do it when you have your little entourage backing you up. You're pathetic." The situation was deteriorating rapidly, spinning toward confrontation that would force Thora to choose between maintaining her promise or defending herself and Wren. She could feel the moment approaching like a train on tracks, inevitable and approaching fast. Before anyone could say anything else, a teacher, Ms. Rodriguez from the art department, appeared and cut through the gathering crowd with authority. "What's going on here? Why isn't everyone at lunch?" The groups dispersed quickly, unwilling to face questions about what had clearly been a confrontation brewing toward violence. Vanessa and her followers retreated toward the main building, though not before Vanessa shot Thora a look that promised this wasn't over. Wren retrieved her lunch bag from where Kendall had dropped it and approached Thora carefully. "Are you okay?" Wren asked, studying Thora's face with concern. Thora nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Something had broken inside her today, some dam that had been holding back her willingness to respond physically to physical threats. She had grabbed Vanessa's hand, not violently, not aggressively, but enough to prove she was capable of defending herself. And while that single action had felt justified and even necessary, it also felt like the beginning of a slope she had sworn not to descend. "I need to tell you something," Thora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something about me you don't know." They sat down at the picnic table, and for the first time, Thora explained everything. She told Wren about her father, about his boxing career and his struggles with violence, about the promise she had made as he lay dying, about her training at Alvarez boxing gym every morning before school. She described the discipline she had learned, the skills she had developed, and the internal conflict of having abilities she had sworn never to use outside the ring. Wren listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through surprise, understanding, and finally a kind of protective fierceness. "So, you could have fought back this whole time?" she asked when Thora finished. "You could have stopped all of this weeks ago?" "Maybe," Thora admitted, "but that's not who I want to be. My father made me promise I wouldn't become like him, wouldn't use my training to hurt people out of anger or ego, and I've been trying to honor that promise." "But Thora," Wren said gently, "there's a difference between using your skills to bully people and using them to defend yourself. Your father was warning you against becoming an aggressor, not against protecting yourself when you're being victimized." "I know," Thora said miserably. "Or at least, I understand that intellectually, but the line feels so thin. How do I know when I'm defending myself versus when I'm just finding an excuse to hit someone who deserves it? How do I know I won't cross that line once I start? Ren reached across the table and took Thora's hands in hers. Because you've proven who you are over the last 2 months. You've endured harassment and abuse that would have broken most people, and you've never once retaliated with violence. You've never threatened anyone, never postures or tried to intimidate. You're not your father, Thora. You're you. Someone who values peace and self-control so much, you've let yourself be hurt rather than risk becoming something you hate. That's not weakness. That's incredible strength. Tears pricked at the corners of Thora's eyes. I'm so tired, she admitted. I'm tired of being scared, tired of being hungry, because I can't eat my lunch without it being stolen, tired of watching them hurt you because you dared to be kind to me. I don't know how much more I can take. Then maybe it's time to stop taking it, Ren said quietly. Not by becoming a bully yourself, but by setting boundaries and enforcing them. You have the right to exist without being harassed. You have the right to defend yourself when attacked. And I think your father would understand that, would want you to understand that. They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped across the table, while Thora processed everything. She thought about Coach Maria's words about knowing when the moment came, about instincts guiding her toward the right decision. She thought about her father, about what he would truly want for her versus what she had convinced herself he wanted. And she thought about Ren, about protecting someone who had shown her kindness and acceptance, about whether allowing that person to be hurt in order to maintain her own moral purity was actually moral at all. The decision didn't come all at once. It accumulated gradually over the next few days as the harassment continued to escalate. Someone spray-painted a homophobic slur on Ren's car. Thora's mother received an anonymous letter claiming her daughter was involved in drugs and promiscuous behavior, lies designed to damage their relationship. The social media harassment intensified, with fake accounts posting cruel memes and edited photos of both Thora and Ren. But beneath the continued abuse, something was changing in Thora. Her morning training at the gym took on new intensity, not preparation for competition, but preparation for an inevitability she could finally see approaching. Coach Maria noticed the shift and asked about it. "They're pushing you toward a choice," Coach Maria observed after a particularly brutal heavy bag session, where Thora had been throwing combinations with barely controlled fury. "The bullies at your school. They're not going to stop until either you break or you stand up. You know that, right?" "I know," Thora admitted, unwrapping her hands and examining the familiar calluses and minor abrasions that marked her knuckles. "Your father's promise was important," Coach Maria continued carefully, "but he never meant for you to be a victim. He meant for you to be disciplined, to choose when to fight, rather than fighting reflexively out of anger or ego. When someone pushes you beyond all reasonable boundaries, defending yourself isn't breaking that promise. It's honoring the training we do every morning. We train so you can protect yourself when you need to, not so you can be a martyr." "What if I can't control it?" Thora asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if I start and can't stop? What if all the anger I've been holding back just explodes and I hurt someone badly?" Coach Maria met her eyes seriously. "You won't. You know why? Because you've been controlling it for months already. Every time they've pushed you, every time you've wanted to hit back, you've controlled that impulse. That control doesn't disappear the moment you defend yourself. It becomes part of how you defend yourself. Trust your training. Trust what we've built together." Thora nodded slowly, feeling something solidify inside her, a decision forming, not made rashly but arriving as the culmination of weeks of thought and struggle. On Friday of the 8th week, the moment Coach Maria had predicted arrived with devastating clarity. Thora was in the hallway between classes, heading toward her locker to exchange textbooks, when she heard a commotion ahead. Students were gathering in a cluster, phones out and recording, the familiar predatory excitement that accompanied any conflict or drama. She pushed through the crowd and felt her stomach drop. Wren was backed against a row of lockers by Vanessa and her entire group. Someone had dumped what looked like an entire bottle of paint, bright red acrylic, over Wren's head and clothes, leaving her dripping and shocked. The paint had soaked through her clothes and was dripping onto the floor, creating a scene that looked disturbingly like a violent scene from a horror movie. "Oops," Vanessa said loudly for the benefit of the recording phones. "Guess you should have been more careful around the art supplies. That's going to stain." Wren's face was a mask of humiliation and barely suppressed tears. She was trying to wipe paint from her eyes, hands shaking with emotion. And Vanessa wasn't finished. She had another bottle of paint in her hand, this one bright yellow, and she was opening it with deliberate slowness while her followers laughed and egged her on. Something inside Thora snapped cleanly. Not a break born of rage or loss of control, but a decisive severing of the cord that had kept her passive for too long. She moved through the crowd with purpose, her stride smooth and confident, and when she stepped into the circle that had formed around Wren and her tormentors, the quality of her movement made several students instinctively shift back. "That's enough," Thora said, her voice cutting through the noise with unexpected authority. Not loud, but carrying weight and intent that commanded attention. Vanessa turned to face her, surprise flickering across her features before being replaced with mockery. "Look who finally decided to grow a spine. What are you going to do about it, loser? Run away like you always do?" Thora didn't respond with words. She reached out and gently touched Wren's shoulder, making eye contact and conveying with that brief connection that she was here, that Wren wasn't alone, that this ended now. Then she turned her full attention to Vanessa, and her posture shifted in subtle ways that transformed her entire presence. Her feet positioned in a fighter's stance, left foot forward, right foot back, weight balanced, knees slightly bent. Her hands came up in a proper guard position, protecting her head and centerline, elbows in, chin tucked. Her shoulders relaxed but ready, breathing controlled and steady. Every element of her body language suddenly screamed fighter, trained and capable, no longer the hunched and defensive victim they had been tormenting for weeks. The transformation was so complete and unexpected that several people in the crowd audibly gasped. Phones continued recording, but the energy had shifted from entertained mockery to something else. Anticipation mixed with uncertainty, the sense that they were about to witness something significant. "What the hell?" Kendall said, her voice uncertain. "What are you doing?" "Put down the paint," Thora said, still addressing Vanessa, "and apologize to Wren. Then walk away and never bother either of us again." Vanessa laughed, but it sounded forced and nervous. "Or what? You're going to fight me? You're like 100 pounds. I'll destroy you." "No," Thora said calmly. "You won't. But I'm giving you the chance to end this without finding that out. Make the smart choice." For a moment, Vanessa seemed to actually consider it, but then she glanced at her followers, at the crowd recording, at the social stakes of backing down, and her ego won out over her survival instincts. She tossed the unopened paint bottle to Brianna and stepped forward, raising her fists in what was probably meant to be an intimidating fighting stance, but actually had no structural integrity. Hands too low, chin exposed, weight too far forward, no balance or foundation. "Bring it, bitch," Vanessa said, and threw a looping right hand that was slow and telegraphed and desperate, born from movies and imagination rather than any actual training. Thora slipped the punch with a simple turn of her torso and shift of her head, the kind of defensive movement she had drilled 10,000 times in the gym. Vanessa's fist passed harmlessly through empty air, carrying her off balance with her own momentum. Before Vanessa could recover, Thora stepped in and threw a perfect straight right hand that landed square on Vanessa's nose with a sharp crack that echoed down the hallway. It wasn't thrown with full power. Thora had pulled it significantly, using maybe 30% of what she was capable of, but it was thrown with perfect technique. Hip rotation, shoulder behind the punch, fist properly aligned, snap and return. The impact was enough to rock Vanessa's head back and send her stumbling backward into the lockers, blood immediately streaming from her nose, her eyes watering involuntarily from the pain. The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations and excited shouting. Phones captured every angle of the moment, preserving it in digital permanence. Vanessa touched her nose and stared at the blood on her fingers with an expression of disbelief, as if the reality of physical consequences had never occurred to her despite her willingness to inflict them on others. "You bitch," she sputtered. "You broke my fucking nose." "It's not broken," Thora said clinically, maintaining her stance and position. "If it was broken, you'd know it. This is just a bloody nose from a jab I pulled. If I had wanted to break it, I would have." Kendall and Brianna moved forward to support Vanessa, but their body language was uncertain. The sight of their leader, bleeding and defeated, had shaken their confidence in the natural order they had assumed governed Roosevelt's social dynamics. Other members of Vanessa's extended group hung back, unwilling to risk becoming the next target, now that Thora had revealed herself as someone capable of defending herself. "You psycho!" Vanessa screamed, still trying to stop the blood flowing from her nose. "I'm going to have you expelled. My father is going to sue you and your trash mother. You're done here." "You attacked me," Thora said, her voice still calm and controlled, despite the adrenaline humming through her system. "You threw the first punch. Everyone saw it. Every phone here recorded it." She gestured to the crowd, to the dozens of students holding devices that had captured Vanessa's aggression and Thora's defensive response. "I defended myself using minimal force. That's not assault. That's self-defense. And if you want to escalate this to administrators or lawyers, we can talk about weeks of documented harassment, bullying, destruction of property, and the sexual images you posted on my locker. I'm sure your father would love to hear about all of that." The threat landed with visible impact. Vanessa's face, already pale from shock and pain, went even whiter as she realized the precariousness of her position. Her eyes darted around the crowd, seeing not allies but witnesses who had watched her campaign of cruelty unfold and could testify against her if pushed. "This isn't over," Vanessa said, but the words had no weight, no conviction. She was making sounds because silence would have been admission of defeat. "Yeah," Thora said quietly. "It is. It's over. Because if you come near me or Ren again, I won't pull my punches. I won't go looking for trouble, but I won't run from it either. You picked the wrong person to torment, and now you know it. Walk away while you still can." Kendall and Brianna helped Vanessa move toward the main office to get her nose treated, leaving a trail of blood drops on the floor. The crowd began to disperse, students chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed, phones already uploading videos to social media where they would spread through the school within minutes. Thora turned to Ren, her fighting stance dropping away as concern replaced combat readiness. "Are you okay?" she asked, taking in the paint-covered state of Ren's clothes and hair. Ren let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. "Am I okay?" "Thora, I know," Thora said. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." They went to the nearest bathroom, which was mercifully empty. Thora helped Ren clean as much paint as possible from her hair and face using paper towels and hand soap, though it was clear she would need a proper shower to get it all out. The red and yellow paint had mixed in places to create an orange mess that would probably take days to fully wash out. "I'm so sorry," Ren said, as Thora gently worked paint from her hair. "I'm so sorry you had to do that. I know you didn't want to—" "Don't apologize," Thora interrupted firmly. "You have nothing to be sorry for. They crossed every line. They pushed until I had to choose between keeping a promise to someone who's dead or protecting someone who's alive and matters to me. And I chose you. I'll always choose you." Wren met her eyes in the mirror, both of them paint-splattered and exhausted, and said, "I love you. Is that crazy? We've only known each other for a few weeks, but I love you, and I don't care if it's too soon or inappropriate or whatever." Thora felt warmth spread through her chest, cutting through the residual adrenaline and tension. "It's not crazy," she said softly. "I love you too." They stood in that dingy bathroom with its flickering fluorescent lights and perpetual smell of industrial cleaner, surrounded by the evidence of harassment and the aftermath of violence, and kissed for the first time. It was tentative and sweet and tasted faintly of paint chemicals, and it was perfect in its imperfection. A teacher found them eventually and escorted them both to the main office, where Mr. Henderson sat behind his desk, looking simultaneously annoyed and resigned to dealing with another incident he wished he could ignore. "Miss Quinley," he said heavily, "I understand you struck another student." "In self-defense," Thora replied, her voice steady and clear. "Vanessa Sterling threw the first punch. There are at least 50 witnesses and multiple video recordings that will confirm that. She and her friends have been harassing me and Wren Castellanos for weeks, and today they assaulted Wren with paint before Vanessa physically attacked me. I defended myself using minimal necessary force." Henderson's expression suggested he knew this was going to be complicated. Before he could respond, his desk phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment. Then his face went through a series of interesting color changes. "I see," he said. "Yes, I understand. Yes, she's here now. I'll handle it." He hung up and looked at Thora with an expression that might have been grudging respect. "That was Superintendent Collins. Apparently the video of your altercation with Miss Sterling has already gone viral on social media and is being shared widely among students and parents. The superintendent wants to meet with you, your mother, Miss Sterling, and her parents tomorrow morning to resolve this situation." "Fine," Thora said. "My mother will be there." Henderson studied her for a long moment. "You could have done that weeks ago," he said finally. "Stop the bullying, I mean. Why didn't you?" "Because I was trying to be better than them," Thora replied. "Because I made a promise to someone I loved to never use my skills in anger. Because I believed that walking away was stronger than fighting back." She paused, then added, "But I was wrong. Sometimes walking away just enables cruelty. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them they can't continue without consequences." She was suspended for 3 days. Standard procedure for any physical altercation, regardless of circumstances. Wren was sent home to clean up, and Thora, waiting in the office for her mother to arrive, finally allowed herself to process everything that had happened. Her hands were shaking with residual adrenaline. Her right knuckles ached where they had connected with Vanessa's nose, and she felt a complicated mixture of guilt, relief, vindication, and fear about what she had done and what it meant. But underneath all of that was something else, a sense of liberation. She had stood up for herself. She had protected someone she loved. She had set a boundary and enforced it, and the sky hadn't fallen. She hadn't become a violent bully. She had simply refused to continue being a victim. Her mother arrived 20 minutes later, still in her nurse's scrubs from her shift at the hospital, her face creased with worry and confusion. Mr. Henderson explained the situation as clinically as possible, showing her the video that had been sent to the school administration. Thora watched her mother watch the footage, Vanessa throwing the first punch, Thora's defensive movement and precise counter, the aftermath. When the video ended, her mother turned to her and asked, "Have you been boxing?" "Every morning," Thora admitted, "at a gym near our apartment. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I needed something that was mine." Her mother was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said, "Your father would be proud of you." Not for hitting someone, he'd hate that part, but for defending yourself instead of being destroyed by staying passive, for knowing when enough was enough, for being disciplined even in conflict. Thora felt tears finally break free, running down her cheeks. I tried to keep my promise to him. I really tried. I know you did, sweetheart, her mother said, pulling her into a tight embrace. And you kept the spirit of that promise. You didn't become a bully. You didn't go looking for fights. You defended yourself when you were left with no other option. That's exactly what he would have wanted for you. They left the school together, and Thora felt a strange sense of peace despite the chaos and uncertainty ahead. Whatever consequences came, whatever happened at the meeting tomorrow, she had done the right thing. She had finally learned the difference between avoiding violence out of discipline and allowing yourself to be victimized out of fear. The suspension gave Thora time to think and process everything. She spent the mornings at Alvarez boxing gym as always, and Coach Maria worked her hard but didn't push for details about what had happened until Thora was ready to share. When she finally did, the coach listened carefully and then nodded with satisfaction. You did good, she said simply. You controlled yourself. You used minimal force. You defended someone who needed defending. That's what all this training is for, not to make you aggressive, but to give you options when someone else forces conflict on you. Your father would understand that, Thora cried during the heavy bag session that followed, her tears mixing with sweat as she threw combinations and worked through months of accumulated emotion. It was cathartic in a way she hadn't expected, a physical release of tension that had been building since her first day at Roosevelt. She and Ren texted constantly during the suspension. Ren reported that the atmosphere at school had completely changed. The video of Thora defending herself had spread, not just through Roosevelt, but to other schools in the district, becoming a viral moment that captured people's attention. Students who had been silent witnesses to the bullying were coming forward with their own stories of harassment by Vanessa's group. The tide of social opinion had turned decisively against the bullies, and several were facing their own suspensions for harassment and assault. You're like a folk hero now, Ren texted on the second day. People are calling you the boxing ghost because nobody knew you could fight. It's kind of amazing. I'm not a hero, Thora texted back. I just got tired of being a victim. That's exactly why you're a hero, Ren replied. You showed everyone else who's been bullied that they don't have to just take it, that standing up for yourself is possible. The meeting on Monday morning was tense and awkward. Vanessa's father was indeed a prominent lawyer, an imposing man in an expensive suit who started with threats and bluster about pressing charges and pursuing civil litigation. But Superintendent Collins, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had clearly seen every variety of parent and student conflict in her career, cut through the posturing with efficient brutality. Mr. Sterling, I've reviewed extensive documentation of your daughter's behavior over the past 2 months. We have witness statements describing persistent harassment, vandalism, theft, and assault. We have video evidence of her throwing the first punch in the physical altercation, and we have social media posts that constitute sexual harassment and defamation. If you want to discuss pressing charges, we can certainly do that, but it's your daughter who will face the more serious consequences. The lawyer's aggressive posture deflated somewhat. My daughter was defending herself against... Against what? Collins interrupted. Against a girl who sat quietly and endured abuse for weeks without retaliation. Against a student who only responded with minimal force when physically attacked. The video is clear, Mr. Sterling. Your daughter initiated violence and Miss Quinley defended herself with remarkable restraint. Vanessa sat beside her father, looking small and miserable, her nose bandaged and her eyes downcast. Her mother, a thin woman who looked like she sustained herself entirely on anxiety and expensive skincare products, kept shooting her husband worried glances that suggested she knew their position was untenable. The end result was a compromise that satisfied no one, but at least resolved the immediate situation. Vanessa and her main followers would serve 2-week suspensions and be required to complete mandatory counseling about bullying and conflict resolution. They would be prohibited from any contact with Thora or Ren for the remainder of the school year, with expulsion as the consequence for any violations. Thora's suspension would be reduced to time served, the 3 days already missed, and she would return to school with no further disciplinary action. In addition, the school administration would implement new anti-bullying policies and training for both staff and students, acknowledging their failures to address the harassment when it was first reported. When the meeting concluded and they left the administrative building, Thora's mother squeezed her shoulder. "How do you feel?" she asked. Thora considered the question carefully. "Tired," she said finally, "but also free. Like I can finally breathe." Returning to Roosevelt on Tuesday felt surreal. Students Thora had never spoken to approached to introduce themselves, to thank her for standing up to Vanessa, to share their own stories of being bullied or witnessing bullying without knowing how to intervene. Several admitted they had been afraid to help her earlier, ashamed of their cowardice, but paralyzed by fear of becoming targets themselves. "I get it," Thora told them when they apologized. "Fear is powerful, but so is courage, and courage is contagious. When one person stands up, it makes it easier for others to do the same." Walking through the hallways that had been sites of humiliation and harassment for so long felt different now. Her posture was straighter, her gaze direct, and when she passed students in the corridors, they greeted her with respect or stepped aside to give her space. Not out of fear, she'd been careful not to cultivate intimidation, but out of recognition that she was someone who wouldn't be pushed around anymore. She found Ren waiting at their usual picnic table in the courtyard at lunch, and her face broke into a huge smile when she saw Thora approaching. They hugged tightly, holding on to each other in a way that communicated everything words couldn't capture. "I missed you," Ren said. 3 days felt like forever." "I missed you too," Thora replied. She pulled out her lunch bag. Her mother had packed extra today, knowing that Thora could finally eat without fear, and they settled in to eat together in peace for the first time since they had met. Other students began drifting toward the courtyard throughout the lunch period, drawn by word that this was a safe space, a place where the usual social hierarchies didn't apply. By the time lunch ended, there were 7 students scattered across various tables in the courtyard, all eating and talking and existing without the constant tension that had characterized the cafeteria. "We started something," Ren observed, watching the small crowd. "A safe zone." "Yeah," Thora agreed. "We did." Over the following weeks, Roosevelt High School underwent a transformation that felt almost miraculous in its scope and speed. The absence of Vanessa and her followers during their suspension created a power vacuum that was filled not by another group of bullies, but by a collective decision among students to be better. Teachers who had previously looked away from harassment began intervening actively. The administration held assemblies about bystander responsibility and empowerment. And gradually, incrementally, the culture shifted towards something healthier. Thora found herself in an unexpected position of influence. Students asked her advice on handling conflict, on standing up for themselves without becoming aggressive. She tried to share what she had learned about discipline and control, about the difference between defending yourself and seeking violence. She emphasized that her boxing training wasn't what made her strong. The strength came from knowing who she was and what she stood for. The training just gave her tools to enforce boundaries when necessary. In the 6th week after the confrontation, something unexpected happened. Thora was at her locker after school when Vanessa approached alone, without her usual entourage. She had returned from suspension the previous week and had been keeping a low profile, avoiding eye contact with everyone and eating lunch in isolated corners. "Can I talk to you?" Vanessa asked, her voice quiet and uncertain, nothing like the confident mockery that had characterized her previous interactions. Thora studied her for a moment, assessing threat level on instinct before consciously relaxing. "Okay," she said carefully. They walked to an empty classroom and sat across from each other, the silence stretching uncomfortably before Vanessa finally spoke. "I wanted to apologize," she said, the words clearly difficult, "for everything I did to you and Ren. For the harassment, the bullying, all of it. It was cruel and wrong, and I have no excuse that makes it okay." Thora waited, saying nothing, letting Vanessa work through whatever she had come here to say. "I've been in therapy since the suspension," Vanessa continued. "My parents made me go. At first I was just angry about everything, but the therapist helped me see—" She paused, struggling with the words. "She helped me see that I was using cruelty as a way to feel powerful because I felt powerless in my own life. My dad is never home, my mom is more concerned with appearances than with me, and I learned that if I couldn't control my own family situation, at least I could control how other people treated me through fear. It's fucked up. I was fucked up." "Was?" Thora asked quietly. "Am," Vanessa corrected. "I'm working on it. The therapy is helping, but I know that doesn't fix what I did or undo the damage. I hurt you. I made your life hell for no reason other than my own issues, and I'm genuinely deeply sorry." Thora took a slow breath, processing the apology that was both more than she had expected and somehow still not enough to balance against weeks of torment. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally. "Genuinely. It takes courage to acknowledge when you've been wrong and to apologize." "But," Vanessa prompted, clearly sensing there was more coming. "But an apology doesn't mean automatic forgiveness or friendship," Thora continued. "It's a start, but rebuilding trust takes time and consistent behavior, not just words. What you did caused real damage. To me, to Ren, to other students you targeted before us. You can't just apologize and expect everything to be okay." "I know," Vanessa said, nodding. "I'm not expecting us to be friends. I'm not even asking for forgiveness right now. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did was wrong and I'm trying to change. And if there's ever anything I can do to make amends, I will." They talked for a while longer, Vanessa explaining her home situation in more detail, describing the pressure she felt to maintain perfect grades and perfect appearance and perfect social status, how that pressure had twisted into something toxic. Thora shared some of her own background, carefully edited, but enough to establish common ground in their understanding of how family expectations and grief could shape behavior in destructive ways. When they finally left the classroom, they weren't friends, but they had reached something like understanding. Vanessa kept her distance in the weeks that followed, but Thora noticed her intervening when she saw other students being bullied, using her social capital for good instead of harm. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was genuine, and Thora found herself hoping it would continue. As winter approached and the academic year moved into its third month, Thora's life had settled into something that felt almost normal. She continued training at Alvarez Boxing Gym every morning, but now she did so without the internal conflict about whether she was betraying her father's memory. Coach Maria helped her understand that the training and the discipline weren't about learning to hurt people. They were about learning control, both of her body and her responses to the world. Her relationship with Ren deepened and strengthened, moving from the initial intensity of crisis-bonded connection into something more sustainable and genuine. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing, shared their fears and dreams and complicated feelings about identity and belonging. They went on actual dates, movies and coffee shops and long walks through neighborhoods where they could be themselves without worrying about social consequences. One evening in November, they sat in Wren's parked car after a movie, talking and watching the sun set behind the strip malls and fast food restaurants that lined the commercial district. "I've been thinking," Wren said, her hand clasped in Thora's, "about what happened with Vanessa, with everything at school, about how you were afraid that fighting back would make you like your father, would make you a bully." "Yeah," Thora said, sensing there was a point coming. "I think you proved something important," Wren continued. "Not just to everyone at school, but to yourself. You proved that strength and violence aren't the same thing, that you can be capable of protecting yourself without becoming cruel, that knowing how to fight doesn't mean you have to fight. You embodied the discipline your father wanted to teach you, even when using that discipline looked different than you expected." Thora felt emotion well up in her chest. "I miss him," she said quietly. "I wish he could have seen how this turned out. I wish I could tell him that I understand now what he was trying to teach me." "I think he knows," Wren said, squeezing her hand. "And I think he'd be proud of exactly who you became. Someone strong enough to endure, wise enough to know when endurance became enabling, and disciplined enough to respond with just enough force and no more. That's not easy. Most people either become victims or become bullies because they can't find that balance. You did." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky cycle through shades of orange and pink and purple as the sun completed its descent. Eventually Wren said, "I love you. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know I mean it. Not just because you defended me or because we survived something hard together. I love you because of who you are, all of it, the shy parts and the strong parts and the complicated parts." "I love you too," Thora replied, meaning it with her whole heart. "You saved me just as much as I defended you. You showed me what it meant to have someone in your corner, someone who saw me as more than just a victim or a target. You gave me a reason to stop accepting abuse as inevitable." By the time spring arrived, Roosevelt High School had become a place Thora could navigate without constant vigilance and fear. The courtyard where she and Wren had first eaten lunch together had become an established gathering place for students who wanted space away from the social intensity of the main cafeteria. The administration had followed through on their promises of anti-bullying programs and teacher training, creating accountability structures that hadn't existed before. Thora even found herself becoming something of an unlikely mentor to other students dealing with harassment. A freshman boy who was being bullied for his size and mannerisms approached her after hearing about her story, asking for advice. She met with him and several others who faced similar situations, teaching them not boxing techniques, but rather strategies for maintaining dignity, setting boundaries, and knowing when to seek help versus when to stand up for themselves. "The goal isn't to become a fighter," she told them during one of these informal meetings in the library. "The goal is to become someone who can't be easily victimized. That comes from confidence, from knowing your own worth, from having people who support you. Physical skills can be part of that, but they're not the only part, or even the most important part. The most important thing is deciding that you deserve respect and that you won't accept being treated as less than human." One afternoon in April, Thora was walking through the main hallway when she saw a familiar scene unfolding. A larger student blocking a smaller one against the lockers, voice raised in aggressive confrontation, while other students watched with uncomfortable fascination. Without thinking about it, Thora altered her course and approached. "That's enough," she said firmly, her voice carrying authority that had been absent months ago. "Walk away." The aggressor turned to see who was interrupting and immediately recognized Thora. His expression cycled through annoyance, recognition, and then uncertainty. as he apparently decided that escalating with her wasn't worth whatever satisfaction he'd get from continuing to hassle his original target. "Whatever," he muttered, stepping back and affecting an air of not caring, even as he retreated down the hallway. The smaller student, a freshman girl with wide eyes and trembling hands, looked at Thora with a mixture of relief and awe. "Thank you," she whispered. "Are you okay?" Thora asked gently. The girl nodded, not quite trusting her voice. "If he bothers you again, report it," Thora said, "and if you need someone to walk with you, or just someone to talk to, I'm usually in the art courtyard at lunch. You're not alone here." As she walked away, Thora felt something settle into place inside her, a sense of purpose that had been missing before. She couldn't prevent all bullying, couldn't single-handedly fix Roosevelt's social dynamics, but she could be present, could intervene when she witnessed injustice, could offer support to those who needed it. That was enough. That mattered. On a warm day in May, as the academic year was winding toward its conclusion, Thora sat in the courtyard with Wren during their lunch period. The space had filled significantly since they first started eating there. At least 15 students were scattered across the various tables and benches, talking and laughing and existing in peace. The transformation felt complete in a way Thora hadn't quite expected. "Remember when it was just us?" Wren asked, following Thora's gaze across the populated courtyard. "I remember being terrified every day," Thora replied, "dreading coming to school, feeling like I was drowning and nobody cared enough to throw a lifeline." "And now?" Thora considered the question seriously. "Now I feel like I belong somewhere. Like I found my people. You, obviously, but also all these other students who just wanted a place where they didn't have to perform or compete or constantly defend themselves. We created something good out of something terrible." Wren leaned her head on Thora's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and affection they no longer felt the need to hide. "You created something good. You stood up when nobody else would. You showed everyone that change was possible." "We," Thora corrected. "We did this together. I couldn't have gotten through any of it without you." They finished their lunch in comfortable silence, enjoying the spring sunshine and the sound of their peers' conversations creating a background hum of normalcy. As the warning bell rang and students began gathering their belongings to head to next period classes, Thora felt a sudden urge to preserve this moment, to mark the significance of how far she had come from that terrified new student who had first walked through Roosevelt's doors. She pulled out her phone and asked Wren, "Can we take a picture? I want to remember this." They took a selfie together, both smiling genuinely, with the populated courtyard visible behind them, evidence of the community they had helped build. Thora looked at the image and felt satisfaction mixed with bitter sweetness. She would graduate in a year, would move on to whatever came next, but the impact of what had happened here would continue. The students who had learned to stand up for themselves and others wouldn't forget those lessons. The cultural shift at Roosevelt would outlast her presence. That evening, at Alvarez Boxing Gym for her regular training session, Coach Maria worked her through a technical sparring session with another student, controlled rounds, where the focus was on precision and defensive movement rather than power or aggression. Thora moved smoothly, her footwork clean, her combinations crisp, her defense tight. She felt the familiar satisfaction of executing techniques she had drilled thousands of times, the muscle memory that made complex movements feel effortless. After the session, as she was unwrapping her hands and cooling down, Coach Maria approached with a thoughtful expression. "You've grown a lot," the coach observed, "not just as a boxer but as a person. When you first came here after your father died, you were so full of grief and confusion. You didn't know who you were supposed to be or how to honor his memory while also being yourself." "I still struggle with that sometimes," Thora admitted. Everyone does, Coach Maria said, but you found your answer. You figured out that honoring your father didn't mean never fighting. It meant fighting with discipline and purpose, only when necessary, with control and restraint. You became exactly what he hoped you'd become, someone strong who chooses when to use that strength instead of being controlled by it. Thora felt tears prick at her eyes. I wish I could tell him that. I wish I could show him that I understand now. I think he knows, Coach Maria said, echoing Wren's earlier sentiment. And I think he's proud. I know I am. Walking home from the gym as the sun set and the spring air filled with the smell of blooming flowers, Thora reflected on the entirety of her journey. She had come to Roosevelt as a victim, had endured weeks of systematic abuse while clinging to a promise that she had misunderstood. She had found love and friendship in unexpected places, had been pushed to a breaking point that forced her to re-examine what strength and discipline truly meant, and she had emerged on the other side transformed, not into a bully or an aggressor, but into someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept being treated as less than human. The final week of school arrived with the typical chaos of end-of-year activities and exams. Thora navigated it all with a sense of calm she couldn't have imagined at the beginning of the year. She aced her finals, secure in knowledge she had managed to maintain despite the emotional toll of the bullying. She attended the year-end assembly where various students received awards and recognition. And she watched as the school year concluded without fanfare, just a gradual emptying of halls and classrooms as students departed for summer break. On the last day, Thora stood by her locker, the same locker that had been vandalized and broken into, that had been covered in cruel notes and obscene images that had represented so much of her suffering, and felt a sense of completion. She cleaned out the remaining contents methodically, throwing away old papers and organizing textbooks to return to the library. Wren found her there and asked, "Ready to get out of here for the summer?" "More than ready," Thora replied with a smile. "I'm thinking we should do something special. Road trip, maybe. Get away from everything and just exist without the weight of all this school drama." "That sounds perfect," Wren agreed. "I'll talk to my parents about borrowing the car for a week." They walked out of Roosevelt High School together, crossing the parking lot toward where Wren had parked that morning. The building loomed behind them, no longer menacing but simply a place, walls and concrete and windows that held memories both terrible and triumphant. Thora felt no particular attachment to it, but she also felt no fear. It had been a battlefield, and she had survived. That was enough. As they reached the car, Thora turned for one final look at the school. She saw other students streaming out, heading towards summer freedom with various degrees of enthusiasm. She saw younger students who would return next year to navigate their own challenges and dramas. And she saw, standing near the entrance, a familiar figure watching her. Vanessa Sterling stood alone, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her expression neutral but not hostile. She raised one hand in a small wave, not friendly exactly, but acknowledging. Thora returned the gesture with equal neutrality. They weren't friends, and probably never would be, but they had reached understanding. Vanessa had learned consequences, had begun the long process of becoming someone better than she had been. That was all Thora could ask for. Driving away from Roosevelt with Wren beside her, windows down and music playing, Thora felt the accumulated tension of the entire school year finally release. She thought about her father, about the promise she had made, and how she had learned to fulfill it in ways neither of them had anticipated. She had not become violent or cruel. She had not sought out conflict or used her skills to dominate others. But when pushed beyond all reasonable boundaries, when defending herself and protecting someone she loved, she had stood up with controlled precision and appropriate force. That was the true lesson of discipline, not avoiding all conflict, but knowing when conflict was necessary and how to engage it without losing your humanity in the process. "What are you thinking about?" Ren asked, noticing Thora's contemplative expression. "Everything," Thora replied. "The whole year. How much changed. How much I changed." "Do you regret any of it?" Thora considered the question carefully. She regretted the suffering, regretted that anyone had to experience bullying and harassment. She regretted that adults had failed to intervene when they should have, that the system had protected bullies until forced to acknowledge the problem. But she didn't regret who she had become through the process, didn't regret standing up when the moment demanded it, didn't regret finding love and friendship in the midst of adversity. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. I wish it hadn't been necessary, but I don't regret how I responded. I learned things about myself that I needed to learn. I found you, which I wouldn't trade for anything, and maybe I helped some other people along the way. That matters." "It does matter," Ren agreed. "You matter. What you did mattered. Don't ever forget that." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the landscape rolling past, strip malls and housing developments giving way to more open spaces as they left the immediate area around school. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in golden light, and Thora felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She thought about the months ahead. Summer with Ren, returning to school next year without the constant stress of bullying, continuing her training at the gym, building toward a future that felt suddenly full of possibility. She thought about the other students at Roosevelt who had benefited from the cultural shift that had started with one defensive punch, about how courage could ripple outward in ways you couldn't predict or control. And she thought about her father, about the man he had been and the legacy he had left. She understood now that his final promise hadn't been a prohibition against ever fighting. It had been a warning about fighting for the wrong reasons, about letting anger and ego drive your actions. He had wanted her to be strong, but not cruel, capable, but not violent, disciplined enough to know when to use her skills and when to walk away. She had honored that promise, even when it meant enduring suffering. And when the moment came, when walking away meant allowing cruelty to flourish unchecked, when defending herself and others became morally necessary, she had acted with exactly the precision and restraint he had trained into her. That was the real victory, not the punch that bloodied Vanessa's nose, but the years of discipline that ensured it was the minimum force necessary rather than the maximum force possible. The victory was in choosing when to fight, rather than being controlled by anger or fear. The victory was in remaining human even when given justification to be monstrous. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon and evening painted the sky in shades of deep purple and indigo, Thora reached across the console and took Ren's hand, feeling the warmth and solidity of her grip. This was what mattered: connection, love, mutual support, the courage to stand together against cruelty. Everything else was just context, just challenges to overcome and lessons to learn. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now, no longer frightening in their vulnerability. "I love you too," Ren replied, glancing over with a smile that lit up her entire face. And as they drove into the evening, towards summer and whatever adventures it would bring, Thora felt the weight of the past year finally lift completely. She had been tested and had emerged stronger. She had been hurt and had learned to heal. She had been afraid and had discovered courage. Most importantly, she had learned the difference between being a victim and being someone who could be hurt but refused to be broken, between avoiding violence out of fear and choosing peace from a position of strength. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, full of challenges she couldn't predict and opportunities she couldn't yet imagine. But she would face it all with Ren beside her, with the discipline her father had taught her, with the understanding Coach Maria had helped her develop, and with the hard-won knowledge that true strength wasn't about dominating others, it was about knowing who you were and refusing to compromise that self, even under pressure. That was the story she would carry forward, the lesson that would shape the rest of her life. Not the story of a girl who got bullied and fought back, but the story of someone who learned when to endure and when to resist, who discovered that mercy was more powerful than vengeance, and who understood that the highest form of discipline was knowing when to fight and having the courage to choose differently when fighting wasn't necessary. In the end, that was everything her father had hoped she would learn and everything she had needed to discover for herself. The journey had been painful and difficult, but it had forged her into someone stronger and wiser than she had been before. Someone who could walk through the world unafraid, not because she lacked fear, but because she knew how to face it with dignity and strength. And that, ultimately, was the only victory that truly mattered.